Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action Podcast again, back with another video. And in this one, I wanted to touch on a quite old paper and a very well-known and influential idea, the generalized motor program and schema theory of Richard Schmidt. I wanted to do this for a couple of reasons. Now, I think, in understanding information processing theory approaches to skill acquisition, right, this is one of the most prominent ones that's been put forth. So I think it's important to understand. I also want to address a couple of issues related to it that I got feedback about relative to my very first presentation on the two skill acquisition approaches. So I'll get on that. And finally, I want to end by talking about how the discussion of the motor program, the contention between the motor program and dynamical systems theory kind of mirrors this contention we're having now between the ecological and information processing approaches, how it's really nothing new, and what can we learn from this contentions that happened before. Okay, so let's dive into this. As I said, obviously the motor program is GMP is very involved. There's a long history of research on it. I'm not going to go into all the studies, and I just want to kind of give a general overview and talk about some of the pros and cons of it. So what is a motor program, right? So a motor program is an idea that's been around for a long, long time, right? And there's various forms. Schmidt's is the most famous because it addresses kind of some serious problems with the general idea of a motor program. And part of the issue I see in the field is that people have kind of spun out of Schmidt's very specific idea and use this very generally in a lot of ways. But the basic definition of a motor program is a set of muscle commands that are structured before a movement sequence begins, and it allows the entire sequence to be carried out or uninfluenced by peripheral feedback. Okay. And as Schmidt points out, even though at the time people first started thinking about motor programs, the computers weren't around. It's basically a computer analogy of motor control. It's storing a program for how to move in an internal model, right? And using that to produce movements, right? So very generally, that's an idea that has persisted, right? All current information processing models have essentially some form of a motor program. I mean, most of them don't specify specific muscle commands, but that this idea that there's this internal storage for something to move is still a very persistent idea. Why? What motivated people to generate and come up with this idea of motor program? Why do we think we need it? Right? As the quote from Keel suggested, right, one of the dominant ideas that motor programs are necessary for really fast actions, right? With really fast actions, say if I have to move within less than half a second, we know that the time it takes visual information to get back up to my visual system, allow me to correct my hand movement, there's not enough time for me to use feedback, right? So as Schmidt says, it's obviously that quick actions must somehow be organized in advance and represented in memory, right? And I'm going to address these motivations later on. Using feedback, using online control, essentially, is too slow to account for quick actions, right? So that's one of the main motivations. Another one is that this idea of anticipation, right? In a lot of sports skills and a lot of things, we need to use information before the event actually starts, right? If we're going to be successful, like I need to use advanced cues or situational probabilities, right? And how else could we do anticipation without some form of motor program that's going to use that information to program the movement ahead of time, right? In order to use anticipation, essentially involves starting the process of moving, whether it's just programming, ahead of time, right? And this quote is kind of expressing that. So the evidence that we need anticipation in sports seems to support a motor program. And third is this interesting idea that keeps coming up. It's come up through the history of motor control research. And, I've tested it and promoted it in a lot of ways, is that having to attend to information, having to control things online and pick up information is somehow a burden for our system, right? It's a cognitive burden that we don't want, right? We want to get to the state where we can do things unconsciously, right? And automatically the system can run off on its own without me having to focus on my environment, okay? They allow for execution with minimal involvement of attention, the burden of control, okay? As Schmidt says, the subject of learning motor skills is develop open loop programs to free ourselves from feedback. So somehow processing information, picking up information from our environment is a burdensome, right? That's a common idea that has persisted in motor learning and motor control. So those are the whys, why we want to have this stored plan program for generating movements in memory. Is that the motivation? So as I said, the basic idea of motor program was around for a long time. This idea that we'd had a stored set of muscle commands to produce a movement. Schmidt identified, and a lot of people were aware of this, there was a few problems with these, but there was two main ones. One was the storage problem, right? So if I'm going, and both of these, as I say at the bottom, are the result of the original idea there being a one-to-one mapping between the program and the action, right? So I'd have a motor program for jumping, for walking, for running, for doing, skipping, right? So the storage problem is I need a set of motor commands for every possible action I can generate and every variant of that action, right? Because there's specific muscle commands. So I need a massive storage in my head. The other problem that people identified was the problem of novelty. How could I ever come up with a new movement, right? If all I had were these stored programs, right? There's no way I could come up with a new way to throw a ball, for example. So those are the two problems. So Schmidt came along, and Schmidt, he fully admits that there's nothing revolutionary new about his idea of schema theory and the generalized motor program. Really, what he did was put a bunch of ideas that were already around, the idea of memory schema and motor programs together in a novel way to address these problems. So it was very obviously, this is one of the most influential papers in motor learning there is, right? So obviously it was a good idea, but as he said, it's not like he came up with a completely new concept. And as I showed there, I actually talked about Schmidt when he passed away a few years ago. Hugely influential person in motor control and motor learning. I talked about him in that episode and a bit about schema theory and generalized motor program. But in this today, I want to just go through the basic ideas again, right? So one of the first things, and I said earlier, I think this is part of the issue. One of the first things to note is what Schmidt intended the motor program to be for, right? In his idea, what it was a theory of was discrete actions, right? So actions that are very fast and short, right? A ballistic action, right? Hitting an object really quickly, right? Throwing an object really quickly. He didn't intend it to be for continuous actions, right? Running to catch a ball, right? Steering a car and juggling. So where they occur over a longer period, because the basic idea is when there's a longer period, it's not a super quick action. It allows for feedback to be used, right? So we don't necessarily need just the motor program. It gets more complicated. As I said, even though Schmidt says this directly at the start of the paper, it's been extended. The basic idea of a motor program seems to have been extended to all of kind of sporting actions. Part of it, I think, is a little confusing. It's sometimes when Schmidt writes, he talks about less than 5 seconds and quite short in time, less than 5 seconds. 5 seconds is not quite short in motor control time periods, right? There's tons of time to use feedback in 5 seconds, right? 100 milliseconds, 150 milliseconds maybe, but 5 seconds. So there's this problem, I think, that people have abstracted the general concept of a motor program and into areas that maybe Schmidt didn't mean it to be. But in some ways, he wasn't 100% clear on that. So I think that's somewhat understandable. So, but that's what he meant it before. Discrete actions that have a discrete beginning and end and are too fast to allow for feedback. Okay. So what is Schmidt's theory? Schmidt's theory, as I said, it's addressing these problems. It has two basic parts, right? So the basic part is going to move from a motor program to a generalized motor program, or GMP, and it's going to add these memory structures called schema, right? That's the two big innovations that Schmidt had. So what are these? So a generalized motor program, or a GMP, defines the basic form of an action, right? It's the fundamental pattern or invariance in movement. What is the basic structure of throwing, right? What are the invariant features? What are the features involved in throwing? I.e., my elbow goes here, so what are the basic patterns, right? And Schmidt's idea is instead of having a motor program that was specific to every possible action we could perform, we had motor programs that were generalized for a class of actions. So we had one motor program for throwing that just had the basic form and structure in it. And then we could parameterize it to make a bunch of different types of throwing actions, right? Any possible angles. If we wanted to throw something really slow versus really fast, so really long versus really short, all of those things could be handled by this general motorized program because it has the basic structure, but you can change the values within it to do different things. Okay. So, so you could have a single program, right? So this is the idea. Okay. The key to this is he's moving away from a one-to-one match between a motor program and the actions, right? You have a generalized motor program that covers a class of actions, right? So it allows you to, this solves it helps solve both the storage problem, right? You don't need a million programs, one for every action. And also novelty. I can do different kinds of throwing motions because I can start with this general form. Okay. So what's in the GMP, right? And as I said, this is something a few people gave me feedback about. Sometimes I get feedback from people that I misrepresent the information processing approach. And, I've studied it for a long time and did research in it. So I think I know about it, but maybe I get some things wrong. I'm fully willing to accept that, but it's not on purpose. One of the things that people claimed was one of the things I mentioned in my original skill acquisition presentation about what's in a motor program. But so Schmidt's idea was that what's stored in a motor program was two things originally: relative timing and relative force. Okay. Although later on, as you can see at the bottom, he kind of moved away from the relative force idea, and I'll show you why at the end, right? I'll talk about why at the end. The basic problem is relative force would not work very well because of gravity and other factors. So the main thing that's been studied in terms of the GMP is relative timing. The initial hunch based on the evidence at the time was that the relative time, the temporal structure, was invariant, and that some rate parameter could scale the structure appropriate at time, right? So the fact that relative timing and relative force are what's in a motor program, and although we might want to not include force, are what people had a bit of a contention with, because I said in my original thing that how people use the idea of a general motorized program and what's in it are postural, right? And so, when we coach based on the idea of having a motor program, we usually specify a bunch of postures. You need to have your knees bent, your head down, right? This was an example I gave from baseball pitching. This was from an actual manual on how to coach baseball pitching, right? And what I said is that information processing approach tends to focus on postures, right? Whereas ecological approach tends to focus more on controlling forces, right? And so people were like, well, force is in GMP and it doesn't say anything about structure. But I'd like to think about that a little bit more. What do we mean by relative? What is relative timing? Relative timing of what, right? What, to me, Schmidt meant by that, and if you look at his papers in which they study this, it's referring to hitting certain positions, i.e. postures, at certain times, okay? So the way that he represents a relative timing is in terms of position in space over time, right? And the figure on the right is showing a study he did where he made two people learn two relative timings, right? So relative timing to me means my elbow needs to be at this position, right? At this halfway through my movement. My shoulder needs to be at this position 3/4 of the way through the movement. That's what these figures are showing, right? It doesn't mean they need to have absolute timing, right? My elbow could be that position in 1 second or half a second or 2 seconds, depending on when I want to slow. But the relative timing between my elbow and shoulder needs to be specified, is what's in the generalized motor program. That's what we're going to train in athletes. Get this relative timing of where your shoulder is relative to your elbow, right? And to me, that's exactly what this is saying. That example I gave before, the throwing angle should be positioned above the during the trunk rotation. That's a statement about relative timing, right? That's a statement about a relative timing of the positions in space, right? So for me, the idea that relative timing is what's in a GMP implies we're talking about postures, right? That's where that idea came from. That's what I meant by that. Right. And I'm sorry if I caused people confusion about that. But so that to me, that's what goes in. And part of the problem is in overall with this theory, that what's in the GMP is a little, and how it gets there is a little vague. But that's so GMP is basically in storing these invariant features, things that are always there when you throw, like the invariant features. And as I said in other presentations I've given, nobody's denying that there aren't invariant features, right? And as I said, I give Bernstein's example. There's certain properties to when you use a hammer. There's certain that are always there, right? There's certain properties to throwing that are always going to be there, the invariant features. And for Schmidt in a GMP, those invariant features were mostly relative timing. Okay. The GMP, how is it actually used? Okay. So the motor program is just this general structure, right? To actually use it, we're going to have to give it parameters, right? So we know that the shoulder angle has to be in this position halfway through the relative to the elbow position. We know the relative timing of when these two things happen, but we need to specify the actual timing and the actual forces, right? So we need to parameterize the generalized motor program, right? And that's where schema come in, okay? So schema, there's two different types he proposed. Give the parameters to the generalized motor program and let it generate a movement, okay? So they scale the GMP appropriately for a given situation. They take in the conditions, right? You perceive what's going on in your environment, you know what you want to achieve, and you parameterize this general throwing GMP. The GMP contains a set of invariant features that were shared within a movement class. Specific movement parameters are specified, okay, to actually generate a movement. And for Schmidt, these came from the fact that kind of through trial and error and practicing an activity, what we do in memory, we create this representation that has 4 parts in it, right? So every time I move, there's initial conditions, which I get from my sensory information. I know what position my body is initially in. I know where the target is visually, so on. I generate a specification for the motor program on how to move, for example, how to hit something, right? When I move, I generate sensory consequences of that movement. So I generate proprioceptive information. I generate visual information about where my hand goes. And then when I move, I create an outcome, right? Did I hit the target? So for Schmidt, we take all those things and store them together while we're learning. And that what we learn is a relationship between these things, right? So we begin to compare them and contrast them, and we learn, abstract, and pull out a relationship. We create associations between them. And for him, this leads to 2 types of schema. Okay, the recall schema is what is a relationship between the specifications I gave and the outcomes that happen, right? So basically, did my plan work? Did my motor program work, right? So through that, I learned, nope, that my hand went too far. My hand went too far left, right? So I have these kind of relationships. When I did this motor program, my hand went this far, right? Okay, so I have this kind of outcome. Through those relationships, I can generate new motor programs, new parameters, right? And importantly for Schmidt, this allows for novel specifications through a process of interpolation and extrapolation, right? So imagine I threw a ball with this parameters put into my motor program for throwing. I threw a ball and it went, say, a force of 10. The ball went 100 meters, like 20 meters. With a force of 20, the ball went 20 meters, right? Now my goal is to throw 15 meters. Through those relationships I've stored, I can interpolate and specify the force to throw to a distance I've never actually thrown to before, right? Because I know I've abstracted this relationship between my parameters I put in my motor program and the outcome that occurs, right? And This can allow for novel, I put in quotes because there's an issue with this, so I'll talk about later on, movements that I've never actually done before. And I really, Schmidt in his article brings in this wonderful quote from Bartlett when in talking about tennis specifically. When I make a tennis stroke, I do not, as a matter of fact, produce something absolutely new, and I never repeat something old, right? So the idea is, as you know, I've used the quote of Nadal a few times on my podcast and some of these presentations. The idea that the conditions are always different in a motor program, that's okay because I can always interpolate and extrapolate from what I'm doing. So I'm not doing something exactly like I did before, but I'm not doing something completely out there and new either because I can relate it to what I've done before, right? So that's the idea of the recall schema. The other schema is the recognition schema, and this comes from an interesting concept. I'm going to talk about this in more detail on the podcast at some point. This is, to me, one of the most enduring ideas of Schmidt's, right? It's not necessarily just his, but it's in a lot of things you'll see now. For example, predictive coding. It's not the same idea, but the general idea of using of generating. So the idea of recognition schema is that at the same time we're programming a movement, okay, we're generating a predictions about what sensory consequences we should receive from that movement, right? So if I generate a movement to hit something on my table, at the same time I could predict I should feel these forces in my arm, my hand should go there. So I should get visual feedback, specific visual feedback, and I should get this specific proprioceptive feedback. So I can generate a prediction about the sensor, not about the outcome, but the actual prediction about the sensation I should get. And as I said, that is a really core element in this, one of the main information processing theories that's popular now, predictive coding. As I said, it's more complex than that, but the basic idea is the same. So Schmidt, we could do this, and we also have in our schema, in our internal model, we have the relationship between past outcomes and past sensory consequences of movements. So basically this idea is that by predicting the sensory consequences, we get an error signal, right? If I predict this should happen in terms of proprioceptive and visual feedback and it doesn't, that's an error signal telling me I need to change my motor program, the parameters of the motor program, because it's not working. Okay, so this recognition schema gives us an error signal, and all of this can be, you know, Schmidt has some drawings in his paper you can look through if you're interested. It's 1975 paper. So basic idea again, I take the initial conditions, then the environment from sensory information, desired income, and I compare that essentially to past. Okay, this stored schema. I generate from the recall schema, I generate a new movement, right? From in my general program. I also generate a prediction about the sensory consequences, right? And in the recognition schema, I can use this as an error signal to correct me. Okay. So that's the basic idea of the GMP. As I said, there's been a huge amount of work. It makes, importantly, any good theory, it made a lot of predictions about what types of different feedback should affect performance, what kind of practice schedules, like it can make predictions about very random versus block practice, things like that. Not super specific predictions, but it can test those ideas. And there has been a lot of experiments. For example, Gabby Wolf has done a lot of experiments on testing ideas of the GMP that you can look at. I'm not going to review them all here. But the basic idea is that the introduction of this generalized motor program combined with schema solves some of the main problems with the basic motor program idea, mainly the storage problem, right? We don't need a separate program for every possible action because we have this one program for a class of actions, and the novelty problem because we can generate movements. We can generate movements that we've never done before by doing this kind of interpolation and extrapolation from our past experiences in this schema. Okay, so that's Schmidt's general idea. Now, what I want to do is kind of go into some of, for me, Also, this comes from some of the writings that Carl Newell's done about it. Other people have done about it. Some of the problems that still remain and issues with it. And I also want to revisit the motivation for it. So a few of the problems, and all of these quotes I have on these pages are from Schmidt. They're from, very importantly, one of the reasons I admire Schmidt is very critical of his own ideas. And in a paper, I think it was 2003 or 2005, I have the reference at the end. He basically looked at the motor program 25, I think it was 27 years later, 25 years later, he did one too, and he was very critical in pointing out things. And so these are all quotes from him evaluating his theory. So one of the problems with the motor program is the issue of degeneracy or motor equivalence. The idea I can produce the same outcome, right, with completely different combinations of joints, right, joint movements, right. I can serve a volleyball program underhand, overhand, jump serve, right, in all different ways. A motor program cannot explain that, right? You cannot store degeneracy in a motor program, right? We cannot. It would be way too complicated, and Schmidt fully admits that motor equivalence is a serious omission, right? The fact that you can use completely different joint combinations for the same functions can't be handled. One of the main issues that a lot of people have with the GMP, and Schmidt fully admitted that he didn't address this, and as I say at the bottom there, this is a general problem that a lot of us that follow an ecological approach have with information processing theories in general. Where do the representations come from in the first place, right? He does not really say that, right? So a large problem with schema theory is almost completely on how the performer scales the GMP. It never addresses the question of how the GMPs were acquired in the first place or how they're modified. It just simply assumes that the performer had a program for throwing, right? So this is a big problem, right? In the thing. A few other problems. One of them is and I'll show you some other how that connects with this. We've essentially placed the storage problem with a computation problem, right? So instead of storing individual programs for every possible action, now we have to do ridiculously complicated computations to take into account all the initial conditions and all these factors, right? We need a model that accounts for somehow the wind that we can take into account wind or something from our sensory feedback. So if we want to get our movements in a wider range of conditions, there's more and more parameters we're going to have to specify, not beyond relative timing, beyond just timing and force, that are going to become problematic. The computations, the model is going to have to be ridiculously sophisticated and predictive. Related to this is the problem of the linearity of the scaling, right? The relationships between our movements and the outcomes, the forces they generate, the muscle commands, is not perfectly linear, right? So we can't just do simple extrapolation and interpolation between past movements. And Schmidt again admits this temporal variance doesn't hold for a lot of actions. This is the last quote really goes back to the computation problem. For many of the tasks for which the performer cannot plan the action in advance because the need to adjust for environmental disturbances and response produce variability, right? This is Bernstein's problem, context condition variability, right? There's the relationship between your movement and outcome is going to change all the time, right? You would need a super, super complex model to take that into account. Here's an example why Schmidt kind of moved away from the idea that the GMP stores relative force. Okay, here he's talking about the issue of gravity, right? If I do the same movement when I'm wearing a backpack and not wearing a backpack, the load is creating kind of not a simple relationship between muscle commands and movement, right? So again, simply scaling the muscles because the initial conditions tell me I have a heavier weight is not going to solve that problem and lead to success, right? So that's an issue. Some of the other problems, another one, it doesn't, even though the novelty problem is solved, right? We can generate movements we never generate. It doesn't really allow for true novelty or creativity, right? So schema does not accommodate the new action classes or completely different coordination modes, right? The ones that, and this is a quote from Newell. only thing we can generate new are within the action class, right? So I could use the example, people always make fun of ecological psychology because we use the example of Fosbury flop as creativity, right? There's no way you could generate a Fosbury flop from a motor program. Other things, being able to, throw off balance or throw under, sidearm when you're used to throwing overhand, right? Is you're suddenly switching to a totally new pattern of coordination. Motor programs don't handle that very well. Parsimony, right? So the, part of the implications of a motor program is we need it to explain the regularity in movement, right? We need it to account, as I said, there's no denying there's invariance in movement, right? That throwing has certain things that always happen, right? I'm not denying that. The kind of the implication of the motor program and information processing is that these invariance and this regularity comes from a central controller, from representation, right? And the main point that a lot of people in ecological psychology make is that could be the way it is, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? And this is a quote from Schmidt. I agree that order and regularity do not necessarily imply a central timer, right? An alternative way to get regularity and invariance is a coordinative structure, which I've talked about in the past, and it doesn't have any kind of representation or motor program. And the important point here that we make in ecological psychology, yes, there are invariants in movement, right? There are things that are the same from each time you move. It's not completely random every time. But those invariants are products of us moving. They're not causes of the movement, right? They're not pre-stored things that that help generate the movement. They're products of the fact that people share common intrinsic dynamics. They're products of the fact that the constraints in certain situations are very similar, right? The constraints in throwing a baseball are very similar every time, even though there's some changes. The basic constraints, the task constraints are very, very similar. So there's going to be invariance, right? So they're a product of the self-organization, right? They're not the cause of it. Okay, so that's an important point. The other thing I wanted to do was before finishing is returning to the motivations for having the motor program. As I said, this is a general idea, whether you dismiss Schmidt's schema theory and generalized motor program, it's a basic idea that persists through all information processing models. You have some internal model that's generating a movement is a motor program. First of all, I'll point out that anticipation does not require an internal model, right? This is a common, right? The idea that you have to have some internal model that you can pre-program to allow you to anticipate what your opponent is doing is not correct, right? Again, you could do it that way, but as I talked about, I think when this comes out, my episode on strong anticipation in the podcast will be out, and I talk about how you can anticipate without having a predictive internal model. The other thing is I've talked about a few times in the podcast, and I have a paper coming out on baseball batting. I'll go into detail. The idea that having a quick movement in which you don't seem to be using any kind of feedback online has to be done by a motor program is not correct either, right? You can do the same. You can have an open loop feedback-free movement through perspective control if you're using information about the current future and you allow for attractor relaxation, which I've talked about before. And I said I'll get into it later when I do my paper. I don't want to take a little while to explain here. The other one is, this is something that I've changed my thinking about over my course of the career. I used to kind of believe this idea is, why is attending to information and picking up information from our environment seen as such a burden? That why do we have to free ourselves from this? Why do we really want to be automatic and unconscious, right? Being skillful is being in touch with one's environment, connected to one's environment. And this is a quote I've used before is from Ingold. Learning is about attending to things rather than acquiring the knowledge that absolves us of the need to do so, right? A motor program is the last half of that phrase. It's a something we acquire so that we don't have to attend to the environment. I've kind of changed my thinking over the course of my career. Why is that such a burden to have to pick up information? Right? I think that the original ideas of why we want to do that have been kind of lost. The other thing I'll point out, last thing, is in Schmidt, in his 25-year review of motor learning theory, he talks a lot about the alternative, the dynamical systems approach and the ecological approach. And he raises this concern, which at the time was valid. I'm doubtful that a viable theory of motor learning will emerge, nice choice of words, from dynamical systems viewpoint anytime soon. If I'm wrong, I'm willing to be shown, but I haven't seen it yet. So this is 2003. 4 years later, someone responded, right? And when this comes out, this should be available on my website now. The direct learning theory of Jacobs and Michaels directly handles this issue, how we can learn in a dynamical systems approach. And I have that infographic. I'm not going to go into detail here, but on that page there, direct learning page on my website, I go into detail about that. So we did respond to that. Okay, so that's the basic idea, and still some of the issues that remain, and some of my motivation for supporting an ecological approach. If you want to do more reading, these two papers are really good, and I used a fair bit of the ideas from these in this presentation. The Schmidt article, 27 years of schema theory, and Newell's response, right? And I'll also point out, as I mentioned, this kind of state we're in now, a lot of people, and if you in Journal Club 25, the infamous Journal 25, we all reflected on this kind of really strong contention. And for those that aren't on social media or on Twitter, maybe you're not seeing this, but there is a very strong butting of heads between people that like ecological dynamics and people that are kind of resisting it for whatever reason, right? And what I'll point out is this is, as I said, is not new, right? And here's some quotes from the Schmidt 27-year reflection article. For a time, and probably even continuing today, scientists in these areas have developed camps where members, myself included, refuse to be swayed by the arguments of the quote-unquote enemy. So that sounds very much like what's happening now. His other quote, which you can see, this quote is he's showing it's talking about that this competitiveness is a social process. People get, start to get, personality comes out and gets contentious. He talks about how he thinks it affected his ability to get grants and publish, and how it actually made him move away from this area. Okay. And he ends with, Newell contends that by today, the two camps have agreed to disagree, which is probably not far off the mark, right? So I bring this up because I want to point out that this point we're at now, where everyone's butting heads, is not new, right? It's happened before multiple times. So there's no simple solution, right? It seems to always come, and to me, it's unavoidable because these two things are very, very different approaches. Like I keep emphasizing that you can't combine. So, but I think it's important for us to learn from this, the new Schmidt and Newell battle, right, as we move forward. A lot of them, in their articles, they talk about how people are kind of avoiding each other by, for example, studying completely different tasks. And I think, these are sometimes things that we can address. Like try to think of different ways we can, test each other's models and work together, maybe work together on some of those adversarial collaborations I talked about before. So, this is not an easy thing to make just go away. That's, I guess, my point. This kind of butting of heads, and challenging people and being critical of other people is an important part of developing theory and developing science and academia. We just have to do it in the right way. So I hopefully we can learn from this and learn from the example of the motor program and kind of its legacy in the motor learning skill acquisition field. Okay, that's it for today, this presentation. Thanks for joining me, and cheers for now.